At this time, mate, you're under arrest on suspicion of murder. You don't have to say anything, but may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something you later rely in court. Anything you do say may be given evidence. Do you understand?
No. What?
This is Yostin Mosquera, a Colombian adult content creator with a deeply disturbing past. And on the night of July the 10th, 2024, he was seen dragging 2 heavy suitcases across the streets of Bristol, England. It was around midnight when innocent bystanders noticed something strange. They saw a dark red liquid that was leaking from one of the suitcases. That is when they stopped him right then and there in the middle of Clifton Suspension Bridge, giving an entirely new meaning to the word suspense. Moments later, Yostin then dropped the suitcases and ran, shouting, "My boss is really bad," in Spanish, as he pushed down a cyclist who was trying to film him. And when police officers finally opened those 2 suitcases, what they found was not mere evidence, but an absolute nightmare, because inside, they found the remains of not 1, but 2 people. So, who precisely was Yostin Mosquera? Was he actually running from a dangerous cartel, or simply lying to cover up his own tracks? Also, who did the bodies belong to, and how did they end up in 2 suitcases in the middle of one of England's most famous bridges? Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at one of England's most recent murders. Now, this has to be one of the strangest cover-ups that I've ever seen, by the way, so you better buckle up for that one. And to this day, I still don't know why it ended in the way it did. Just a quick reminder here that this channel is run by me and 2 good friends, and of course Nero. There are no corporations here, no Netflix studios, and no AI slop. So, if you want to support channels like this one, please do consider subscribing. What can I say? We're just a small team that values real stories told properly. Anyway, with all of that out the way, please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Yostin Mosquera. Welcome to Bristol, folks. I have to say, Bristol is an amazing city with beautiful contrasts, and it's a place that I'm lucky enough to have called home for 2 years. You have centuries-old cobblestone streets, old shipyards, and some of the most advanced engineering all going on in the same city. Once a thriving port of trade and exploration, Bristol is built on wealth and, of course, coffee. Today, things are a little bit different, and Bristol is better known for its creativity, innovation, and its music. By day, it's charming, colourful, and disarmingly quiet. However, by night, as the fog rolls in over the Avon Gorge, it can take on a very different mood. And in the middle of the night, the horrific story of Yostin Mosquera finally ended right here at the city's most famous landmark, that being the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Now, what you're about to see here is only the beginning of all available footage. And let's just say that the more you go into this story, the more you'll realize how public it all became. It was on a warm summer's night in July of 2024 that bridge staff and a handful of nighttime walkers were all left baffled. They noticed a man struggling with 2 large suitcases, and it appeared that he was both sweating and agitated. And not only did he seem to be in a hurry, but he was also desperately trying and failing to avoid any attention. In fact, one onlooker even jokingly said to him, "That looks really heavy. What's in there? A body?" Well, only a few moments later, those looking over at the man noticed something extraordinarily strange. There seemed to be a dark liquid that was dripping from one of the suitcases, and when they began to ask him questions about it, he grew defensive. Without any warning whatsoever, this strange man then suddenly ran off into the night, leaving both of his suitcases right there on the bridge. By the way, for those of you who don't know Bristol very well, this bridge is one of the busiest spots in the city, and so seeing something so bizarre and ominous was just really strange. Realizing that something was terribly wrong here, one of the witnesses, who turned out to be a cyclist at the time, bravely chased this man down, and that is when this mystery became just as comical as it was bizarre. As you can see in this video, the biker's camera captured the man spin around, shout at the cyclist, and then push him off his bike.
Mira, mi jefe es muy malo.
Detectives would later realize that the man was shouting, "Vete, vete, mi jefe es muy malo," which, when translated from Spanish to English, is "Go away, my boss is really bad." After pushing the cyclist over, he then sprinted away and vanished into Lee Woods. He had quite obviously abandoned both of his suitcases, and so, as the onlookers approached, they realized that one of them was leaking blood.
Emergency, what location?
Clifton Suspension Bridge.
What's the emergency?
Right, we're going to need some police up here quite urgently, I think. We had a gentleman up here who was dragging a case behind him. The case, the wheels are broken and what have you. He says there's car parts and what have you. It's got to be funny, the case is broken and it looks like it's really heavy and there's blood coming out of it. The guy with the case has run off. We're now with the case, it's blood. We're convinced it's blood.
By 11:57 p.m, bridge staff had become so concerned about these suitcases that they called the authorities. Police officers arrived within minutes, and they were ready to deal with whatever was coming their way. But the thing is, by now, that mysterious man was unfortunately long gone, and despite officers sectioning off the entire area, he seemed to have somehow slipped by unnoticed. Meanwhile, back on the bridge, officers were now ready to deal with whatever was in that suitcase, and after opening it up, they realized that it was precisely what everyone had feared. Both suitcases contained human body parts, which were wrapped up and stuffed tightly together, and based on the number of limbs inside those two bags, well, it seemed like they were dealing with a double homicide. Within a matter of minutes, the iconic bridge, which is normally a proud symbol of the city of Bristol, had become the centre of an extraordinarily grim crime scene. As a result, police sealed the bridge off from the public, creating forensic tents and floodlights to analyse the area. By morning, the news was everywhere. 2 suitcases, which were filled with dismembered human remains, had been found on Clifton Bridge. However, there were still many questions that remained. For example, who were the victims? And who is the strange man seen running away from these suitcases? And what possibly could have driven someone to do something so horrific? Well, unfortunately, it would take a lot of work to figure these things out, and so Avon and Somerset police launched an immediate manhunt. Within hours, London's Metropolitan Police Force joined in on this investigation, and surveillance footage was pulled from almost every nearby street. Now at first, their trail was quite sparse. All they really had was several witness statements about this strange man who apparently was dragging 2 suitcases in the middle of the night. They also claimed that he had arrived by taxi with both of those suitcases. There are many more strange details to this story, and trust me here, we will get to those in just a while. The police would promptly tell the public that this man was quite clearly dangerous. The only problem is, they didn't know his name, his location, or his motive. But finally, the following day, and on July the 11th, they had their first breakthrough. You see, hanging from one of the suitcases, investigators found a small luggage tag, and on that tag was an address. Surprisingly, this address was nowhere near Bristol. In fact, it was over 100 miles away in Shepherd's Bush, London. When police officers from the Metropolitan Police Force arrived at the address, they forced their way inside. And although they believed that they were ready for whatever waited for them beyond that front door, well, no amount of training could have prepared them for this. Throughout their investigation, they realized that the flat belonged to 71-year-old Paul Longworth and 62-year-old Albert Alfonso, and detectives already feared that both of these men were very likely the victims. And after breaking in and making their way into the property, investigators found yet another nightmare. Right there in the hallway was a large chest freezer. And when officers lifted the lid, well, let's just say they found the decapitated heads and other body parts of 2 men. And so now it appeared that the couple had been murdered inside of their own home before being butchered and then partially moved more than 100 miles away. Their neighbours were stunned. Quite literally, they were genuinely shocked. I mean, first of all, this sounds like something straight out of a horror movie, but second, Albert and Paul of all people, they just simply couldn't believe it. Having lived here for many years, all of the neighbours knew both Paul and Albert. They were civil partners and, after 2 decades together, had finally formalised their relationship only 1 year prior. To those around them, Paul and Albert were quite clearly untraditional, but they were absolutely inseparable. It turns out that both of them had come from difficult beginnings, meeting each other as teenagers in the foster care system and growing attached to each other ever since. Albert was known as warm and outgoing, and the kind of person who would chat with basically anyone. Over the summer, he would gladly host a barbecue, and during the winter would always try to organise Christmas drinks. Meanwhile, Paul was more the quiet type, but much more a handyman. He was friendly, reliable, and loved to fix things. In fact, he had only retired just a few months before his death. Inside of their home, detectives began the slow and grim process of trying to piece this story together. They noticed bloodstains were located all over the walls and floors, showing obvious signs of chaos throughout. Beside the freezer, they would also find several cutting knives and a hammer, and as you can see, all of them were caked in blood. This was a scene of unimaginable violence, and whoever had killed Paul and Albert must have done so in an incredibly brutal fashion. But who would do such a thing, and why? And obviously, detectives would very quickly turn their attention to whoever that mysterious figure was on Clifton Bridge. It was through witness accounts and background checks that police soon learned that Paul and Albert had recently taken in a lodger who not only fit the mysterious man's description, but was now also missing, and his name is Yostin Andrés Mosquera. Now, Yostin was a 34-year-old man from Colombia who had been staying with Paul and Albert in the weeks prior to their deaths, but now he was gone. Within hours, the Met publicly named Yostin as their primary suspect, where he was described as dangerous, volatile, and believed to be on the run. A wanted notice was then announced across the country, and by the end of the day, he was the UK's most wanted man at the time. As the search for Yostin Mosquera intensified, more details began to surface, and I have to say, they were details that turned this story from a random act of violence into something far more personal. It soon became clear that Yostin was not some random lodger or stranger, but in fact was someone that Albert and Paul had known for several years. You see, before coming over to the UK, Yostin was actually working in Colombia as an adult content creator. Of course, that meaning that he was making explicit videos online. And as it turns out, Albert actually had a fascination with the more extreme side of sexuality too. In fact, this is actually how the two met, because back in the year 2012, Albert found Yostin on a webcam site. Now, at first, the relationship between these two was purely transactional, with Albert paying Yostin for several videos online. However, over time, things became a little more complicated, and by October of 2022, Albert invited Yostin to London. The visit seemed friendly enough at first. Both Albert and Paul welcomed the idea, and although Albert's relationship with Yostin was sexual, Paul was both aware and comfortable with it. After his first visit, Yostin eventually returned to Colombia, where he lived with his wife and his young son. But the friendship/relationship did not end there, because in March of 2024, Paul and Albert even traveled to Colombia to visit him, taking a few weeks out to enjoy the South American sun. Only 3 months later, and in June of 2024, which of course was only a few weeks before their deaths, Yostin then returned to London. Now, I have no idea what his arrangements were with his wife and kid back in Colombia, but once again, Paul and Albert opened their door to him. The man was given a place to stay, a second chance, and even financial help. In fact, Albert would even pay for his English classes at a local school. From the outside, 2 older guys hosting a young adult content creator from another country who also had a wife and kid might have seemed like an odd arrangement. But to be honest with you, at this stage, and after covering more than 300 stories, I think I've seen it all. And if it's not hurting anyone, then you do you. I suppose the real sticking point here is that, in the end, 2 people were hurt. And that's an understatement. So, unknown to both Paul and Albert at the time, but from the very moment that Yostin stepped off of that plane and into their family home, he was actually planning something far more sinister. I mean, it's kind of safe to say at this stage that Yostin was far from grateful. In fact, he was pretty much the total opposite. and instead he saw an opportunity through their love and care. And so, over the following weeks, he quietly studied his hosts, and this included their behavior, their habits, their finances, and even their passwords. Later on, digital forensics would discover that not only had Yostin researched the value of their apartment, but had even dug through their own personal financial spreadsheets, which was found on their PC. And it also turns out that, in secret, he had found all of their account logins, valued all of their assets and savings, and had even tried to open a bank account in their name. To the outside world, this man was merely a lodger just learning English at the local school. However, behind closed doors, Yostin Mosquera was a parasite, and he was just waiting to take over their lives. And by the way, these were not the only things he searched for online. Others include how long does it take for a corpse to decompose, how to kill someone with a single blow to the head, and, of course, large fridge freezers on Facebook Marketplace. I mean, this monster was quite literally plotting to murder his hosts all while he slept in their bed, ate their food, and even shared intimate moments with them. And days later, everything would change. July the 8th, 2024. It was a Monday, and it began like any other day for Paul and Albert. Paul was spending his morning pottering around the apartment, while his partner Albert had gone to work to teach swimming lessons. And it was while Albert was gone that Yostin saw his chance. At 12:30 in the afternoon, neighbours noticed Yostin standing at the window before then pulling the curtains shut. Investigators now believe that this was the moment that he decided to actually set his plan into motion. With the flat sealed and nobody able to peer inside, he then reached for a hammer from Paul's own toolkit. And in a sudden and calculated strike, he then cracked the back of Paul's head open. The first blow must have been absolutely devastating, but from what we can tell, it wasn't the last. In the end, Yostin would strike him a total of 10 times, which was enough to cause unspeakable damage. Defensive wounds, which were later found on Paul's hands, concluded that he had desperately tried to fight back, but sadly, there was no chance. After Paul had passed away, Yostin then dragged his body to the bedroom, lifted the divan bed, and then quite literally stuffed him inside. He then opened the curtains, cleaned the area, and just carried on as usual, completely ignoring the fact that he was now sharing the apartment with a body. Meanwhile, when Albert finally returned home later that afternoon, he had no idea that his partner was now dead, and he wouldn't notice either because, you see, Albert and Yostin actually had plans that evening. As usual, the bedroom had been prepared in such a way for a filming session between the two, and so, after returning home, they began to engage in, let's just say, adult activities. However, this is when, right in front of a camera that was recording at the time, their session turned from sexual to murderous. Video footage, which was later recovered from the crime scene, showed Yostin reaching beneath a cloth on the table, pulling out a knife, and then lunging towards Albert. Albert was stabbed 13 times across his torso, neck, and face, and after a devastating blow to his throat, he tragically passed away in an utterly vulnerable scenario. Tragically, the horror would not end there, because that video would keep on rolling afterwards. In fact, some of it was even released to the public, and as you can see, Yostin can even be seen dancing and singing afterwards. It was so depraved that even detectives would later describe it as psychopathic joy. With both of his hosts now dead, Yostin began the next phase of his plan. While still in the same room as the bodies, he then hacked into their computer, logged into their bank accounts, and then tried to transfer £4,000 to himself. Now, unfortunately for Yostin, that failed. As a result, he then went through all of their belongings for any cash or cards he could find. Later that evening, a surveillance camera caught him at a nearby ATM machine, where he then tried to use Albert's cards to withdraw money. Without going into too much detail, he then began the horrific process of dismembering both Paul and Albert, using only knives and a hacksaw. And you might be wondering, how did Yostin learn how to do this? Well, looking at his internet history, it turns out that he spent hours looking into tutorials online, even studying British serial killers and the techniques that they used. By now, he had ordered a chest freezer to be delivered to the flat the following day, and in the early hours of July the 9th, that freezer arrived. He then placed their heads and other body parts inside, but the rest, like his arms, legs and torso, were all stuffed into 2 suitcases. It is worth noting here that Yostin tried to line all of these limbs with bin bags, of course in an effort to try to contain all of the blood. But as we know, that didn't quite work out. By sunrise, the apartment basically looked mostly ordinary again, of course excluding the massive freezer in the hallway and all of the murder weapons which were just left in the corner of the bedroom. On July the 10th, he then booked a van to transport the suitcases, first planning a trip to Brighton before then changing the destination to Bristol at the very last moment. Detectives now believe that Yostin probably planned to dump their remains in the sea, but then, for whatever reason, instead chose to drop them from one of the UK's most famous bridges. So, before we continue with what happened next, I want to highlight how insane and delusional Yostin is, because it makes you realise how little intelligence he actually has. Now, at this stage in the story, there is no suspicion or even awareness of Paul's or Albert's deaths. Unfortunately, nobody really checked in on them daily apart from each other. So, at least right now, Yostin had the freedom to do whatever he wanted. But of course, as far as guilt was concerned, he had already signed his life away, and that's because not only was he going to be the prime suspect from a perspective of proximity, but the evidence was quite literally screaming at him. I mean, not only was the apartment basically a scrapbook for his fingerprints, but his search history may as well have been titled How to Get Arrested in 5 Easy Steps. And let's not forget here that not only was he leaving clues behind, but he had quite literally recorded his own downfall. Oh, and taken several selfies in front of ATM machines in the process. So, there is no doubt about it, Yostin was going to fall into the spotlight, which meant that he had very precious limited time. And so the long story short here is that during this crucial time, Yostin had 2 options. He could either fly back to Colombia, where extradition treaties are complicated and not guaranteed, or he could stay in the UK and make a complete mess of his cover-up. And unfortunately for him, he would choose the latter, in spectacular fashion. At least in Yostin's mind, his plan was simple. Just find a way to get rid of the bodies and then disappear. So, with that in mind, he arranged transport on the morning of July the 10th. That being a hired man and van that he had found online. Now, there is one small but very important detail to mention here, because this van wasn't like most. It wasn't the usual colour of white, it was red, a colour that is far less common among the millions of white ones out there. And that unique detail would actually later prove crucial, because when officers began to trace Yostin's movements, their very first leads on him would actually come from witnesses who remembered seeing a red van. To the driver himself, it was just another late booking, and someone who wanted to move stuff from London to Bristol on short notice. But of course, unknown to him, in the back of that van were 2 suitcases that were filled with human remains. The driver made the 120-mile journey with Yostin right beside him, not realizing that he was sharing his space with the killer. But Yostin himself was calm, quiet, and unremarkable, even shaking the man's hand and smiling as he said goodbye. Speaking of, they arrived in Bristol later that evening, stopping near the Mall pub in the Clifton area, which is just a short distance from the bridge. From there, Yostin switched to walking towards the bridge, where people would even stop him to ask if he needed help. In fact, he would even have this odd encounter too.
He's being helped by other people across the pedestrian crossing and puts it down sort of 3 yards from us. And my son, who's outgoing, said, "Wow man, that's a very heavy suitcase. What you got in there, a body?"
After that, several surveillance cameras caught him walking towards the bridge. However, just before he approached it, a suitcase wheel would buckle and then snap off. And so, in response, he called a taxi for the final stretch of the journey. The fare seemed to be completely bizarre to the driver, because Yostin essentially asked him to pick him up on one side of the bridge and then drop him off 300 meters away on the other. By the time he reached the other side, it was almost midnight, where he then hauled the 2 suitcases out of the bridge walkway, which were clearly struggling under their weight. Now, obviously, his plan was to then throw them over the railing and let the river below do its thing. By the way, I have no idea why you'd go to one of Bristol's most popular attractions to dispose of 2 bodies when you could have simply dumped them off a lonely pier not even 5 miles away. This man had zero common sense. And thankfully, as we know, fate and a few watchful strangers would not let him get away with these crimes. It seems that even at midnight, Clifton Bridge never truly sleeps. Not only were staff still on duty, but a few local residents were still crossing the bridge when they noticed him struggling. That is when one worker called out and offered to help him, because both suitcases looked heavy, and of course, once he took a second, closer look, he realized that one of them was leaking a dark red liquid. Yostin did try to brush this off, and even mumbled that apparently it was oil. However, the smell and the color told a different story, and nobody was having his excuse. A cyclist who was passing by at the time became rather suspicious, and in that instant, Yostin knew that all of it was over. He then dropped the suitcases on the pavement and ran, the cyclist's phone capturing the surreal chase that followed only seconds afterwards.
Mira. Mi jefe es muy malo.
And in minutes, the emergency services were called to help. Police officers arrived at 11:57 p.m, locking down Clifton Bridge and launching a full investigation. Multiple helicopters swept overhead, using thermal imaging to try to find Yostin. But the man was now gone. With thanks to this luggage tag, which traced back to their flat in Shepherd's Bush, investigators had identified the victims within 36 hours of this discovery. And of course, meanwhile, Yostin Mosquera was now a fugitive on the run. By Saturday, that being July the 13th, the net was slowly closing in on Yostin. By now, his face was quite literally everywhere, including TV screens, police bulletins, and social media. Now, obviously, despite everybody knowing his face, nobody knew where he had actually gone to. I mean, he had basically left that bridge empty-handed, and so most people guessed he was probably still around Bristol. Still, nobody had the faintest of ideas. But not for long. Here's a concerning detail for you, but he was actually roaming the streets of Bristol basically for the entire day, and despite being out in public for several hours, nobody had actually called the police to report anything, which is quite alarming. However, by nightfall, a tip finally came in. This would eventually lead several armed police officers to Bristol Templemeads train station, and right there on the platform, they finally arrested him.
I've got a hand, mate.
Go.
Yeah. I can say the words, I need secure.
Go.
Stay down, John, yeah.
Oh my God. What happened? Oh shit.
Secure.
On your side, mate. What happened? Move your legs out to the front. Sit up.
At this time, mate, you're under arrest on suspicion of murder. You don't have to say anything but may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned, something you later rely in court. Anything you do say may be given evidence. Do you understand?
No. What?
You are currently under arrest for murder, okay?
What's your name, mate?
What?
What's your name? Nombre.
Jot.
Jot.
Yeah.
Dot or Joss?
Jot.
Surname? Jot what?
Jot. Mosquera.
Mosquera?
His arrest was over within seconds, and finally, after 3 days on the run, Yostin was now in handcuffs. By the next day, he was in London, where he would now be interrogated. It is no surprise to learn that, at first, he tried to spin this wild story about self-defense, which even then was still different to the angry boss excuse that he threw at the cyclist. Anyway, Yostin admitted to killing Albert, but claimed it wasn't murder and that he'd only acted in self-defense. According to him, Albert had killed Paul in a jealous rage and then tried to attack him. He also claimed that not only had Albert been abusive, but had even forced him into sexual acts. Now, unfortunately, it is true that Albert had formerly been accused of sexual misconduct a couple of decades prior, but at least in Yostin's case, it very clearly was a desperate lie, and one that detectives saw straight through. For one, Albert was verifiably at work when Paul was murdered. And then, of course, there was Yostin's own digital trail, which just screamed premeditation. By July the 15th, that being only 1 week after their deaths, Yostin was charged with 2 counts of murder. By the time this case went to trial, this horrifying story was undeniably in Yostin's hands. Every detail, including his search history all the way through to those financial transfers, all painted one very clear motive: greed. And in April of 2025, and after months of build-up, he would have to face all of this in trial. Despite the time that had passed, Yostin still tried to dodge all accountability, pleading guilty only to manslaughter after claiming that he had lost control with Albert. But over the following weeks, the jury were shown everything, including the surveillance footage of him closing the curtains before Paul's murder, forensic breakdowns of blood and freezer contents, and, most hauntingly, parts of the video where he danced beside Albert's body. It was so disturbing that jurors were offered trauma support both through and after the trial. On July the 21st, 2025, the jury finally came to their verdict. Without any doubt, they found him guilty on both counts of murder, and as this verdict was read out, Yostin showed no emotion whatsoever. The judge called it one of the cruelest cases that he'd ever seen, declaring that Yostin had devised a thoroughly wicked plan, killed 2 people without remorse, and may never be safe to set free. As a result, Yostin Mosquera was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years and 264 days before parole, meaning that he will very likely die behind bars. As the courtroom emptied, a photo of Albert and Paul was displayed outside, showing 2 men who were happily in love with beers in hand. And I believe this is how they deserve to be remembered, because at its core, this was not only a story about murder, but one about kindness too, and how a man exploited that kindness in the most monstrous way possible. I think stories like this will always be hard to comprehend, purely by the lack of logic from the outset. But what I really struggle with here is understanding Yostin's actions and decisions. Like, for example, I don't know, why on earth would you take 2 bodies to one of Bristol's busiest attractions to do the same thing you could achieve from a lonely pier or cliff? Yostin's critical thinking and decision-making skills are absolutely abysmal, and it does make you wonder if maybe he was dropped on his head a few too many times as a baby. Anyway, those are my thoughts, but what are yours? Because as always, I'd love to know what you think in the comments down below. Anyway folks, I think that's pretty much the end of the video today, but as always, thank you so much for being here, I really do appreciate it. Oh, and by the way, did you know that Coffeehouse Crime is now on Spotify? If you haven't checked us out yet, then please take a look, I'd really appreciate it. Anyway folks, thanks again for watching, and as always, I'll see you again very soon for another one. Until that moment arrives though, remember to stay safe and stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.